Picture this. It's 1834, and the royal palace in Madrid looms like a tomb, its icy halls echoing with dread. The king, Ferdinand VII, lies dead, yet his torment claws at the living. You're a royal healer, bound by a blood oath, summoned to a candlelit chamber where a monstrous secret festers. Beneath silk sheets lies not just a corpse, but the grotesque truth of Ferdinand's deformed manhood, a twisted curse born of inbred bloodlines. So horrific it haunted his wives like a spectral predator. Each queen suffered its shadow. Their screams swallowed by stone walls, their lives crushed under royal shame. This anatomical horror didn't just scar flesh. It warped an empire, sowing chaos in Spain's heart. As you approach, hands trembling, the air grows heavy with the stench of decay and dread. What nightmare awaits? Will you dare uncover the truth that doomed a dynasty? Before we delve into this chilling tale of royal decay, psychological torment, and the quiet revenge of the oppressed feminine spirit inspired by Carl Jung's archetypes of the shadow and the animus, if you crave stories that expose the hidden horrors of history, while empowering the silenced voices of women, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below with where you're watching from. It is fascinating how these ancient shadows connect us across time and space in our shared quest for truth and inner strength. To grasp the nightmare that was Ferdinand VII, we must trace it back to the poisoned well of royal inbreeding. A genetic labyrinth where the Habsburgs and Bourbons entangle their blood like thorns in a crown. Born on October 14, 1784 at the Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was the son of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, first cousins whose union was a grim echo of centuries of familial unions. Designed to preserve power, but instead bred monstrosities. Jung would call this the collective shadow of the monarchy. Unacknowledged flaws manifesting as physical and psychic deformities, devouring the individual from within, from infancy. Whispers circulated among the palace midwives. Ferdinand's body developed unevenly, his features marked by the infamous Habsburg jaw. But it was in adolescence that the true horror emerged. Court physicians, documenting in veiled Latin entries hidden in Vatican vaults, described his phallus as an abomination, unnaturally elongated, misshapen like a gnarled root. Thin at the base, yet ballooning to impossible girth, curved in ways that defied anatomy. One report chilled the reader, the prince's organ. Exceeding 10 inches in repose, and far more in rousal, bears protuberances of unknown purpose, rendering congress not merely difficult but perilous. The psychological scar was deeper than any flesh. In an era idolizing classical restraint where manhood was measured by poise, not excess, Ferdinand's affliction branded him a freak. He felt the cold sting of isolation in the opulent halls, where mirrors reflected a monster back at him, servants averted eyes, courtiers stifled snickers. Fueled a paranoia that Jung might interpret as the unintegrated shadow, the dark, repressed self erupting in rage. Young Ferdinand withdrew into secrecy, his mind a labyrinth of shame and suspicion, lashing out at those who glimpsed his vulnerability. A page boy, catching him undressed, was flogged and exiled, his cries echoing through the stone corridors like a harbinger of the tyrant's rise. As he matured, Ferdinand's internal conflict intensified. He yearned for normalcy, for the animus, the masculine archetype, to assert dominance. Yet his body betrayed him. Alchemists peddled elixirs of rhino horn and pearl dust, promising shrinkage or potency. But they only deepened his despair. The palace air grew heavy with the scent of burning incense from feudal rituals, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows that mocked his form. Isolation bred cruelty. He saw betrayal in every bow, every smile. His father's weakness and mother's affairs taught him that trust was folly. But his deformity etched the lesson in blood. The pod builds to a crescendo as Ferdinand approaches manhood, his mind fracturing under the weight. Desperate for heirs to legitimize his rule, he faces the ultimate confrontation, marriage, yet. As whispers of his curse spread to foreign courts, potential brides recoiled in hushed horror. The stage is set for a series of unions that would not unite, but destroy, escalating from unsettling rumor to visceral terror, and in the cold silence of the palace night, Ferdinand lies awake, the dread of exposure coiling like a serpent in his gut, unaware that his shadow would soon engulf not just him, but the women fated to share his bed. Ferdinand's adolescence unfurled like a venomous vine creeping through the gilded halls of the Spanish court, where every shadow whispered betrayal. Born in 1780 to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, his early years had been shrouded in the opulence of El Escorial, a sprawling palace monastery that doubled as a fortress against the world. But as he entered his late teens, the genetic curse of generations of inbred royalty marriages between cousins and uncles in the Bourbon and Habsburg lines began to twist his body in ways that no crown could conceal. Historical accounts from court physicians, preserved in dusty archives, describe a congenital deformity of the genitals, likely hypospadias or a more severe malformation, rendering normal relations excruciating. This wasn't mere rumor. It was a dynastic tragedy, echoing the infamous Habsburg jaw that had plagued his ancestors, but far more intimate and humiliating. Imagine the young prince, barely 18, summoned to dimly lit chambers where doctors in starched collars and powdered wigs huddled like conspirators. The room reeked of camphor salves and lavender oils, futile attempts to drown the metallic tang of fear. Their instruments' gold calipers and probing rods gleamed under flickering candlelight as they measured and documented, their voices dropping to whispers. The royal seed may never take root. Ferdinand's eyes, dark and piercing, bore into them, his deformed frame hunched in a velvet robe that did little to hide the asymmetry. He knew the verdict before they spoke. Intimacy would be a battlefield of pain. Conception an impossible dream. In that moment, the seed of paranoia germinated not just from physical agony, but from the crushing weight of legacy. As heir to a throne that demanded virility to secure the bloodline, he saw his body as a betrayal by God and genetics alike. Psychologically, this crucible forged a monster from a boy's shattered soul. Drawing from Carl Jung's archetype of the shadow, the repressed aspects of the self that, when ignored, erupt in destruction, Ferdinand's deformity became the ultimate denial. He couldn't integrate his vulnerability. Instead, it projected outward as venomous rage. Shame curdled into vindictiveness, a toxic alchemy where every meal reflected not just his form, but the mocking gaze of an uncaring universe. Nights blurred into feverish wanderings through the palace corridors, the cold marble floors echoing his uneven gait like accusatory footsteps. He pressed his ear to doors, catching fragments of servants' gossip. The prince, the freak of nature, unfit for the throne. One fateful evening in 1800, a young maid named Isabella, emboldened by wine in the kitchens, laughed about the royal monstrosity with her peers. By dawn, she was gone, whisked away to a distant convent, or worse, as rumors swirled. Ferdinand never confirmed her fate, but the silence that followed was his first taste of power's intoxicating hush. It fed his isolation, turning the court into a labyrinth of invisible enemies. Cold sweats plagued him, a visceral reminder of his inner chaos, as if his skin itself rebelled against containment. His education, overseen by enlightened tutors imported from France and Italy, only widened the fracture in his psyche. They praised his strategic brilliance. Ferdinand devoured treatises on warfare by Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, sketching battle plans that revealed a mind sharp as a stiletto. Yet, they recoiled from his darker impulses. Gardeners reported small animals, rabbits, birds found mutilated, their tiny bodies ranged in grotesque tableaux, as if Ferdinand were waging war on creation itself for cursing him. This cruelty wasn't mindless. It was a cathartic release, a way to externalize the rage against his own monstrous form, his animus. That Jungian drive toward assertiveness walked into a hunger for domination. He began manipulating courtiers with a spider-esque precision, granting a favor to one noble while blackmailing another with overheard secrets. Loyalty or ruin, he'd murmur in shadowed alcoves, his voice a silken threat. But beneath this facade of control lurked raw vulnerability. Dreams tormented him, vivid nightmares where he stood naked in the throne room, courtiers' laughter swelling like thunder, his deformity spotlighted under chandeliers. He'd wake gasping, heart pounding, convinced the walls themselves spied on him, as whispers of marriage alliances intensified around 1801. Ferdinand's paranoia escalated into a frenzied storm. The Spanish crown, desperate to perpetuate the Bourbon line amid Napoleon's encroaching shadow over Europe, pressured him toward unions that promised heirs. In secret workshops tucked into the palace's underbelly, royal craftsmen, blacksmiths, and seamstresses bound by oaths of death labored over marital aids. These were no ordinary contrivances, silk cushions molded to cradle his form, leather harnesses etched with discreet gold filigree, vials of exotic oils from Arabia, and traders scented with myrrh and sandalwood to numb the pain. The air hung heavy with beeswax from sealing prototypes, and the acrid sweat of dread. Ferdinand tested them alone in his chambers, the night punctuated by grunts of frustration and shattered glass. Each failure ignited suspicion. Was the oil tainted by a rival? The cushion sabotaged by a disloyal artisan? Foreign diplomats, like the French envoy Talleyrand, sent coded dispatches home. The prince's peculiar affliction endangers the alliance. His temper grows volatile. The climax arrived in 1802 with his betrothal to Maria Antonia of Naples, yet another cousin, sealing the inbred doom. Historical records paint her as a vibrant 18-year-old, daughter of King Ferdinand IV of Naples, arriving in Madrid amid triumphant fanfare trumpets blaring. Crowds lining cobblestone streets as her carriage rattled past. Unaware of the horror ahead, she embodied innocence, her letters home bubbling with excitement about the handsome Spanish prince. Ferdinand, cloaking his anxiety in courtly charm, felt the noose of expectation tighten. Wedding preparations buzzed with veiled tension. Ladies in waiting exchanged furtive glances as special chambers were readied, stocked with potions and pillows. The bridal suite, perfumed with roses to mask the clinical stench of ointments, became a stage for a tragedy. That fateful night, as candles guttered low, Maria Antonia's veil lifted to reveal not romance, but revulsion. Her screams pierced the silence, a roar, animal cry that echoed through the palace like a death knell. What followed was no passionate union, but a mechanical ordeal, guided by physicians lurking in antechambers. Ferdinand's mind, however, spiraled into abyss. Was her horror genuine, or a Neapolitan plot to expose and dethrone him? As dawn crept in, staining the windows blood red, he lay awake, the palace walls pressing like a sarcophagus. This unresolved dread birthed the psychological warfare that would define his reign, his shadow self, once confined to personal torment, now poised to devour brides, courtiers, and the very soul of Spain in a cascade of tyranny and suspicion. Maria Antonia of Naples arrived in Madrid in the autumn of 1802 like a fragile blossom tossed into a tempest. Her carriage wheels grinding over the ancient cobblestones of the Plaza Mayor under a sky heavy with impending rain. At just 17, she was the daughter of King Ferdinand IV of Naples and Maria Carolina, sister to the ill-fated Marie Antoinette lineage steeped in revolutionary shadows and royal excess. Historical chronicles describe her as petite and luminous, with raven hair cascading in curls and eyes like polished onyx. Carrying trunks filled with Neapolitan silks and volumes of Voltaire smuggled past her convent. Tutors, she dreamed of a fairy tale romance. whispering to her maids about the dashing Spanish prince whose portraits depicted a brooding youth with sharp features. But the palace air greeted her with an undercurrent of foreboding, faint echoes of muffled cries from distant wings. Chill draughts snaking through hidden passages where Ferdinand's spies, eunuchs, and informants lurked. Like ghosts in the tapestries. Ferdinand, now 18 and teetering on the edge of his own abyss, met her with feigned warmth in the grand salon, his hand extended in a courtly bow that masked trembling fingers. His eyes, dark pools of turmoil, betrayed the storm raging within a clash of Jungian archetypes where her anima, the embodiment of feminine grace and intuition, collided with his distorted animus. That inner masculine force twisted by shame into a weapon of domination. He saw in her not a partner, but a vessel to redeem his cursed body, a means to silence the courtiers' whispers about the Bourbon line's fragility amid Napoleon's encroaching armies across Europe. As they strolled the manicured gardens of the Bune Retiro Palace, autumn leaves crunching underfoot, like brittle bones Ferdinand spun tales of conquest. But his voice cracked with unspoken dread, the scent of his medicinal ointments lingering like a bitter perfume. The wedding unfolded as a lavish spectacle on October 6, 1802, in the royal basilica of Our Lady of Atocha, where golden altars gleamed under incense clouds and bells tolled like funeral omens. Thousands lined the streets, cheering as fireworks painted the night sky, but inside the cathedral, tension hummed like a taut string. Maria Antonia's gown, embroidered with pearls from the Indies, whispered against the marble as she approached the altar, her heart fluttering with naive excitement. Vows exchanged. The couple retired to the bridal chamber, opulent room in the Palacio Real, its walls draped in crimson velvet to muffle sounds, yet, as night deepened, it transformed into a chamber of horrors. Under cover of darkness, servants delivered the special aids, leather-bound cushions creaking ominously, bottles of oils distilled from bitter herbs and exotic spices. Their cork pops echoing like distant gunfire, physicians hovered in the antechamber, their hushed consultations a symphony of dread, when Ferdinand disrobed by the flickering candlelight, the revelation struck Maria Antonia like lightning cleaving the sky. His misshapen organ loomed alien and immense, curving grotesquely with odd growths and discolorations, a grotesque inheritance from centuries of Habsburg and Bourbon inbreeding. Documented in sealed medical reports as monstrous hypertrophy. Her scream rent the silence, a primal wail of terror that reverberated through the stone walls, leaving her backed against the carved bedpost, chest heaving in isolation. Tears streaming like rivers of shattered illusions. What followed was no tender union, but a violation cloaked in dynastic duty. The physicians intervened with clinical detachment, applying salves that burned like fire, positioning her on the aids as if she were a specimen under dissection. The pain seared dual physical thrusts that tore at her innocence. Psychological torment in the dread of his touch. The sensation of entrapment in a web spun from royal expectation and genetic folly, nights. Dissolved into nightmarish rituals. Ferdinand, driven by desperation, commissioned sealed bonds disguised as aids to stability, their soft rasp against her wrists a constant whisper of captivity. Laudanum became her fragile sanctuary. The opium's hazy veil dulling the edges of horror, but sowing seeds of addiction that gnawed at her spirit in lucid moments. Maria Antonia's internal conflict erupted like a volcano. Schooled in secret on philosophy, devouring Rousseau and Kant by candlelight in her Neapolitan convent, she grappled with her own animus, Jung's archetype of inner strength and logic. Questioning her reduction to a mere vessel for a tainted bloodline. Am I queen or prisoner? She'd murmur to her reflection in the ornate mirrors, her voice cracking with defiance. Yet, shame isolated her further. Whispers among the ladies in waiting, the barren bride, cursed union, mirrored Ferdinand's paranoia, fueling her own suspicions that every glance hid mockery, Hope flickered twice with pregnancies in 1803 and 1805. Quickening pulses in the court as midwives monitored her swelling form. But miscarriages crashed like waves of despair, the first in a torrent of blood staining the dawnlit sheets, her body convulsing in grief, the second, more agonizing, with fetal remnants expelled in a chamber pot under physicians' grim scrutiny, Ferdinand's. Accusations thundered in the dim room, his voice a low growl laced with venom. Sabotage. You poison our future. He paced like a caged beast, convinced her revulsion manifested as willful rejection, his shadow self projecting betrayal onto her fragile frame. Historical accounts, including letters from her confessor, reveal her crumbling resolve, laudanum doses escalating, her once vibrant eyes hollowing into haunted voids, skin paling to ghostly translucence, her descent accelerated into a tragic spiral. By 1806, at 21, she wandered the palace corridors like a spectre, clutching rosaries in the royal chapel where incense hung thick and suffocating, praying for deliverance or plotting silent revenge through passive refusal, feigning illness too. Evade his bed, death claimed her on May 21st, 1806. Officially from a consumptive fever, but court whispers hissed of poison. Arsenic slipped into her tea, perhaps self-inflicted in a final act of empowerment, or orchestrated by Ferdinand's agents to erase his failure. As her body lay in the chilled mortuary, swathed in white linen, Ferdinand stared at her corpse under torchlight, his hollow grief a facade cracking to reveal unchecked rage. Her quiet defiance had planted insidious seeds of doubt in his psyche, foretelling the torment awaiting future brides, his shadow now unbound, poised to devour not just consorts, but the crumbling edifice of Spain itself in an era of war and upheaval. With Maria Antonia's grave barely settled in the royal crypt of El Escorial, its earth still loose under the Spanish sun of 1806. Ferdinand's insatiable quest for a legitimate heir thrust him into the shadows of another doomed alliance. The Napoleonic Wars had ravaged Europe, toppling thrones and retrying maps. Yet Ferdinand, restored to power in 1814 after his exile, fixated on dynastic survival amid the chaos. Whispers in the courts of Lisbon and Madrid sealed the pact, a union with Maria Isabel of Braganza, his own niece, born in 1797 to his sister Carlota Joaquina and King John VI of Portugal. This incestuous match, a desperate bid to consolidate Iberian ties against French threats, echoed the inbred curses that had already warped his form. She arrived in Madrid on a crisp September day in 1816, her royal entourage winding through cheering crowds in the Puerta del Sol, trumpets blaring triumphantly to drown the undercurrent of dread. At 19, Maria Isabel embodied unspoiled youth porcelain skin, auburn curls framing a face of gentle curiosity, her gowns of Portuguese silk whispering promises of renewal. But the Palacio loomed like a mausoleum, its unused chambers exhaling faint scents of decay, dust motes swirling in slanted afternoon light like specters of Ferdinand's past failures. Ferdinand, now 32 and hardened by years of imprisonment and political intrigue, greeted her in the throne room with a mask of avuncular affection, his embrace stiff, eyes flickering with the storm of his unresolved shadow. In Jungian terms, she represented the pure anima feminine grace, intuition and emotional depth untarnished by the world's cruelties poised to clash with his festering animus. Distorted into a tyrannical force by shame and genetic betrayal, historical accounts portray her as romantic and artistic, a patroness who would later inspire the founding of the Museo del Prado, collecting masterpieces amid her turmoil. Yet, naivety blinded her to the horrors ahead. Letters to her family bubbled with excitement about the noble king, unaware that his peculiarity, as diplomats coded it, had already claimed one bride's spirit, the wedding on September 29, 1816. Unfolded in the opulent royal chapel, incense curling thick as fog, veiling the omens in sanctity. Vows exchanged under gilded ceilings, the couple retreated to the bridal suite, where preparations had evolved into grotesque sophistication. European craftsmen, summoned from Vienna and Paris under vows of secrecy, had forged new devices, intricate contraptions of polished metal frames cushioned in velvet, adjustable harnesses etched with discreet engravings, and phials of numbing oils infused with opium derivatives from the Orient. The chamber's oppressive warmth, stoked by roaring fires, contrasted the cold touch of these aids, ranged like instruments of torture on a side table. As Ferdinand disrobed in the dim glow of argand lamps, Isabel's horror erupted a mirror of her predecessor's terror. Her screams shattered the night, raw and piercing, her body recoiling instinctively from the sight. The deformed organ, swollen and twisted, pressing like a nightmare incarnate against her flesh. The violation that followed left indelible scars. She flinched at every shadow in the vast halls, the palace's echoing corridors amplifying her isolation, as if the stones themselves absorbed and replayed her cries. In the aftermath, Junjun integration flickered amid her suffering, confronting the dark animus through raw entrance. She sought inner strength in solitude. Hidden diaries, unearthed in later archives, reveal her journaling fears by candlelight. This union is a cage of flesh and duty, where love withers unseen. Ferdinand's paranoia, already a venomous root, intensified into a choking vine, interpreting her revulsion as veiled mockery or Portuguese intrigue, perhaps spies sent by her father to undermine his throne. He installed ornate mirrors in every chamber, their silvered surfaces distorting reality, heightening the dread of constant surveillance. Whispers of conspiracy filled his nights. He interrogated servants, their trembling confessions fueling accusations that Isabel sabotaged their intimacy with feigned ailments. Isabel's psyche fractured under the strain, manifesting in hysterical episodes documented by court physicians as nervous collapses. Nightmares haunted her, visions of the deformity pursuing her through endless, labyrinthine corridors, its grotesque form morphing into accusatory shadows. She'd wake sweat-soaked, sheets tangled like restraints, alone in the cavernous bed, heart thundering with primal fear. Conception attempts devolved into medical spectacles, physicians observing from behind screens, their clinical notes reeking of detachment, jotting details of positions and solves as if cataloguing a failed experiment. Humiliation gnawed at her soul, eroding the romantic idealist into a hollowed vessel. Cruel hope emerged in phantom and real. Pregnancies. In 1817, her belly swelled with illusionary promise, only to deflate in a miscarriage's bloody despair. Waves of grief crashing in the dawnlit chamber. Ferdinand raged in the audience hall, his voice echoing like thunder. Treachery. You deny me my legacy. Accusations flew, mirroring his inner turmoil, projecting betrayal onto her fragile frame. Empowerment flickered in Isabel's resistance, passive defiance through indispositions, locking her doors or retreating to prayer in the chapel, where candle flames danced mockingly. Yet the toll mounted, weight melting from her frame, eyes sinking into haunted depths, vitality ebbing like a receding tide. Tragedy peaked in December 1818. Pregnant again, labor struck prematurely on the 26th, the harrowing ordeal in the royal birthing room. Midwives' hands slick with blood as they extracted a stillborn daughter. Infanta Maria Luisa Isabel, who drew but a few feeble breaths before silence claimed her. Isabel, hemorrhaging from uterine complications, officially puerperal fever, but whispered as exhaustion. Her body and spirit faded in the chilled bed, her final breath a whispered release, eyes closing on a world of unrelenting torment at age 21. The part culminates in Ferdinand's macabre vigil over her corpse in the mortuary chapel, torchlight casting elongated shadows as he commissioned a porcelain death mask. Its stream features staring back accusingly, etching doubt into his fractured mind. Unresolved tension simmered, promising more victims in his quest, yet Isabel's silent entrance, woven with threads of artistic legacy and quiet rebellion, hinted at a feminine resilience that would one day echo in the annals of history, perhaps exacting spectral revenge on the tyrant who devoured her youth. Maria Josepha Amalier of Saxony stepped into the shadowed embrace of Ferdinand's court in the waning days of 1819, a 24-year-old intellect forged in the enlightened halls of Dresden, where her father's library brimmed with tomes on anatomy and philosophy. Born in 1803 as the youngest daughter of Prince Maximilian of Saxony, she had been educated in a strict convent from age 5, emerging not as a meek novice, but a woman armed with reason, a stark contrast to the superstitious decay of Spain under Ferdinand's absolutist rule. The marriage brokered amid the post-Napoleonic reshuffling of European alliances aimed to infuse fresh German blood into the Bourbon line. But whispers in Vienna and Madrid hinted at desperation, to wives buried no heirs and a king teetering on madness. Her arrival at the Palacio Real was cloaked in false pomp, banners fluttering in the crisp autumn wind, trumpets echoing off granite walls, but the air thickened with the musty scent of old blood, and dashed hope's hidden passages, murmuring secrets like veins pulsing beneath the skin. Ferdinand, now 35 and scarred by exile and restoration, viewed her as salvation incarnate, yet his shadow self recoiled at her poised demeanor in dungeon depths. She embodied a quest for integration, her scientific mindset a tool to harmonize the animus, the rational, assertive force against the chaotic anima of royal decay. Prepared by discreet briefings from Saxon diplomats, who alluded to the king's affliction in veiled letters, Josepha approached the union clinically. She brought her own arsenal, a personal physician from Leipzig, versed in emerging gynecology, and subtle devices, padded supports, and herbal infusions packed in lot trunks. Symbols of empowered femininity challenging the patriarchal horror. Yet, the wedding night on October 20th, 1819, shattered even her steely illusions. The ceremony in the royal chapel had been a gilded facade, incense veiling the congregation's pitying glances. But the bridal chamber revealed raw terror. Heavy velvet drapes muffled the world outside, candles casting elongated shadows that danced like accusing spectres. As Ferdinand disrobed, the deformity unveiled itself, a grotesque monument to inbreeding, swollen and contorted, eliciting from Josepha not a scream, but a sharp gasp of cold dread coiling in her gut like iced serpents. Procedures commenced, mechanical and stripped of intimacy, her physician collaborating with Spanish doctors in a hushed symphony of sobs and positions, the creak of aids echoing like chains. Post-coital silence enveloped her, isolation deepening as she lay staring at the canopy, mind racing to dissect the trauma, turning revulsion into data, a rational bulwark against emotional abyss. Ferdinand's suspicion bloomed like a poisonous flower in this fertile ground of doubt, interpreting her composure as disdain or Saxon espionage, perhaps plots to expose his weakness amid liberal uprising. In Spain he intercepted her correspondence, the rustle of paper under spies' hands amplifying his paranoia. Hidden alcoves became confessionals for informants, their reports fueling nocturnal rages where he paced the corridors, convinced her notes harbored treachery. Josepha, undeterred, documented everything in coded journals, anatomical sketches of the encounters, psychological reflections on pain's alchemy. This was her shadow confrontation, Jung's repressed self emerging not in destruction, but analysis trauma transmuted into knowledge, a silent rebellion against the king's tyrannical animus. The escalation crested in 1829, a decade of barren endurance culminating in a miraculous pregnancy amid mounting dread. Historical records veil the details, but court annals suggest a fleeting hope sparked by experimental treatments, her belly swelling as Spain grappled with colonial revolts in the Americas. Ferdinand's euphoria twisted into mania. Guards patrolled every hall. Mystics imported from remote monasteries chanted in incense-choked rooms. The palace transforming into a fortress of fear where even midwives were sworn to secrecy under threat of exile. Josepha's internal conflict raged like a storm, maternal joy tainted by visceral knowledge of the curse's toll, the fetus a potential heir to deformity and despotism. She confided in her journals, "This child, fruit of reason's defiance, carries the weight of empires, yet what shadows will it inherit?" Labor descended in 1829 like a biblical plague. The birthing chamber in Aronyu is scented with blood and sweat, screams piercing the humid air, premature and fraught. The delivery yielded a frail infant girl, her weak cries fading into silence within hours. A tiny corpse swaddled in silk as physicians battled Josepha's rising fever. Infection ravaged her pulpal sepsis, the era's silent killer, her body convulsing in delirium, visions of dissected forms blending with royal ghosts. She lingered weeks, gaze defiant in final lucidity, whispering to her attendant, "Knowledge endures where flesh fails." Death claimed her on May 18, 1829. At the royal palace of Aronyu, officially a fever, but etched in legend as the curse's vengeance. The part concludes with Ferdinand's descent into denial, refusing immediate burial as her body lay in state. The rotting air a chilling omen that permeated the court like guilt's fog. Heartbroken yet unrepentant, he stared at her pallid form, his shadow unchecked, oblivious that Josepha's rational spirit, woven with threads of science and quiet empowerment, had ignited a beacon, paving the shadowed path for the final bride's inevitable revenge in the turbulent twilight of his reign. Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies swept into the decaying grandeur of Madrid's Palacio Real in December 1829 like a calculated tempest, her carriage rumbling over frost-kissed cobblestones under a sky bruised with winter clouds. At 23, she was Ferdinand's niece, daughter of his sister Maria Isabella, and King Francis I of the Two Sicilies, another thread in the tangled web of Bourbon inbreeding that had cursed Spain's monarchy. Historical chronicles paint her as a woman of striking poise, tall and regal, with piercing blue eyes and auburn hair pinned in elaborate coils. Her gowns from Naples' finest ateliers whispering of Mediterranean vitality amid the court's stifling gloom. But beneath this facade burned a secret that would ignite her awakening. She arrived already pregnant, not by the impotent king, but allegedly by a guardsman or courtier in a bold act of defiance against the dynastic machine. This wasn't mere scandal. It was revenge veiled as duty, a cunning strike born from whispers of Ferdinand's affliction that had reached even the sun-drenched palaces of Naples. The palace, transformed into a labyrinth of surveillance after 3 wives' untimely ends, greeted her with chilly winds whistling through cracked windows, carrying the faint, acrid scent of paranoia, like fog rolling off the Monstrous river. Spies lurked in every alcove, their footsteps muffled by threadbare carpets, reporting every glance to Ferdinand, now 45 and a husk of his former self plagued by gout, political betrayals, and the shadow of liberal revolts that had forced him to restore the Constitution in 1820, only to abolish it again in a fit of absolutism. In Jungian terms, Maria Cristina embodied the integrated anima, the feminine archetype of intuition and relational power, rising phoenix-like against the patriarchal shadow that had devoured her predecessors. Where Maria Antonia screamed in innocence, Isabel withered in hysteria, and Josepha dissected in reason, Cristina wielded deception as a weapon. Her animus, that inner assertive force honed by a Neapolitan upbringing amid volcanic passions and court intrigues, knowing from discreet briefings that Ferdinand's deformity rendered him incapable of fatherhood, she feigned compliance, her secret child a matriarchal dagger aimed at his tyrannical heart. The wedding on December 11, 1829. In the royal chapel was a hollow pageant, incense swirling thick as deceit. vows echoing off marble like empty promises. The congregation's murmurs laced with speculation about the miraculous union. Ferdinand, his face a mask of triumphant delusion, clasped her hand with fingers gnarled by illness, eyes glinting with the manic hope of legacy. But the union that followed was pure farce. A theatrical absurdity in the bridal chamber where no true intimacy was needed or possible. Physicians hovered like vultures, their sobs and aids redundant props in Christina's charade. Ferdinand pretended, his touch a cold, threatening graze that sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. But she endured with steely grace, her mind a fortress of calculation in isolated moments. Heart pounding against the silk of her nightgown, she traced her swelling belly in the mirror, whispering affirmations, "This is my power, not his curse." Her internal conflict simmered like lava beneath Vesuvius' guilt clashing with triumph, the moral weight of adultery warring against the exhilaration of subverting a despot. Jung would see this as anima integration, embracing the shadow of deception to reclaim agency. Transforming victimhood into sovereignty, empowerment blossomed in the shadows of Ferdinand's escalating paranoia. He raided her chambers at night, doors crashing open like thunderclaps, guards' lanterns casting grotesque silhouettes as they rifled through drawers for evidence of betrayal. Who is the father? He'd hiss in the dim light, his breath reeking of medicinal wines. Face contorted in rage that mirrored his physical torment. Christina navigated this minefield with masterful cunning. Coded letters smuggled to allies in Naples, faint tears of devotion masking her contempt. Alliances forged with liberal courtiers who saw in her a conduit for reform. Her animus asserted. Through these deceptions, a psychological rebellion where vulnerability fueled resilience. Yet, emotions surged in private nights of solitary weeping in the chapel, candles flickering on altars dedicated to the Virgin, where she confessed her sins and steeled her resolve for Spain. For my child, I endure. The climax erupted with the birth of Isabella on October 10, 1830, in the royal birthing suite at La Granja di San Ildefonso, amid a storm that rattled the windows like omens of upheaval. Labor was a battlefield, screams echoing through halls scented with blood and herbs, midwives' hands guiding the infant into a world already fracturing under Carlos threats Ferdinand's brother. Carlos plotting to claim the throne under Salic law which barred female succession. The child emerged healthy, a girl with Christina's eyes, her cries a triumphant clarion that sealed revenge. A female heir, empowering the Montellini and appending centuries of male dominance. Ferdinand's acceptance was a bitter pill, masked in public jubilation fireworks illuminating Madrid. Bells tolling across the empire, but privately, rage-fisted. The palace echoed with unspoken accusations, his spies redoubling efforts to unearth proof of illegitimacy. Whispers of the guardsman's bastard poisoning the air like arsenic. Christina's strength solidified in this crucible. Confronting her shadows in midnight prayers where doubt gnawed, was this victory worth the souls? Stain, yet triumph prevailed, her gaze steady as she cradled Isabella, envisioning a Spain reformed under her regency. Ferdinand, sensing the shift, grew more isolated. His deformity a metaphor for his crumbling authority gout confining him to chambers where mirrors reflected a broken king. The part lingers on this tense equilibrium, Christina's eyes meeting Ferdinand's across the throne room during a state audience, cold, unresolved, a silent duel of wills hinting at his unraveling. As liberal winds swept Europe, her awakening foretold not just personal redemption, but the dawn of a new era where the fourth bride's cunning would outlive the tyrant's shadow, reshaping Spain's destiny in blood and intrigue. Ferdinand VII's twilight years, from 1830 to his death in 1833, dissolved into a miasma of paranoia that choked the once mighty Spanish Empire, its colonies fracturing like brittle glass under the weight of neglect and rebellion. The Palacio. Real, once a bastion of Bourbon grandeur, had morphed into a gilded prison riddled with mirrors and peepholes, where every reflection twisted into accusation and every whisper hinted at conspiracy. Historical records, including court diaries and diplomatic dispatches, reveal a king haunted by gout, and fevers his body as decayed as his realm, Spain hemorrhaging territories in the Americas. From Mexico's independence in 1821 to the final blows in Peru by 1824, leaving only Cuba and Puerto Rico as fading echoes of empire, the air in his chambers grew stale with suspicion, laced with the acrid tang of medicinal vapors and the metallic bite of fear, as Ferdinand Pastor, in his worsening state, was wheeled through halls echoing with phantom threats. Maria Cristina, now queen and regent in waiting at 24, emerged as a beacon of calculated resilience amid the storm. Her marriage to the ailing 46-year-old king had been a strategic triumph, but in these final years, she wielded subtle power like a shadow dancer, nurturing their daughter Isabella with fierce maternal devotion while integrating a Jungian animus that in her force of assertiveness through political maneuvering. Whispers in the corridors painted her as the true architect of moderation, influencing Ferdinand to surround himself with reformist ministers like Francisco Cia Bermudez, who tempered the ultra-absolutist seal. Yet, her empowerment was a double-edged blade. Rumors of her influence fueled Ferdinand's dread, convincing him that even his wife's gentle counsel masked ulterior motives. In private moments, Cristina grappled with her shadow self-guilt over her deceptions, warring with triumphant resolve, dreams of escape from the palace's suffocating grip haunting her sleep. Where Ferdinand's deformed spectre loomed as both tyrant and victim, sensory dread mounted like a crescendo in a tragic opera. Footsteps rustled in hidden walls, the chill of constant watching prickling skin like invisible fingers. Ferdinand's inspections escalated into frenzied rituals, food tasters summoned at every meal, their faces paling under scrutiny as they sampled dishes, occasionally collapsing in convulsions that confirmed or fabricated plots of poison. Midnight accusations rang out through the marble halls, his voice a ragged bellow echoing off tapestries depicting long-lost glories, treason. He'd cry, dragging courtiers from bedchambers for interrogations, their pleas drowned in the king's delirious rants. Historical accounts detail his obsession with paternity, commissioning portraits of Isabella that mocked him from gilded frames, her cherubic features a stark contrast to his haggard visage, fueling suspicions that she was not his blood but the fruit of Cristina's alleged infidelity. These artworks, preserved in Madrid's archives, capture the king's fractured psyche, eyes wild with doubt, hands clenched as if grasping at sleeping power. Cristina's internal struggle deepened the drama, a psychological tempest where fear clashed with unyielding resolve. Jung would interpret her as confronting the patriarchal shadow embodied by Ferdinand, his animus distorted into domination, hers awakening in acts of quiet subversion. She navigated his spies with encrypted missives to liberal allies, her heart pounding in isolated alcoves where she plotted the regency, envisioning a Spain reformed beyond his absolutist grip. Yet, vulnerability gnawed, nightmares of Ferdinand's wrath, his accusations stripping her bare, mirroring the humiliation of his marital ordeals. Spain crumbled around them, colonies lost in bloody uprisings led by figures like Simon Bolivar, the treasury bankrupt from endless wars, liberal revolts simmering in the shadows. Ferdinand obsessed over these failures, blaming phantoms rather than his own ineptitude, his shadow self projecting betrayal onto a world that had long outgrown his tyranny. The confrontation peaked in the sweltering summer of 1832 at the royal palace of La Granja. A verdant retreat turned inferno of intrigue. Ferdinand, ravaged by a coach accident and ensuing fevers, lay delirious, convinced Cristina orchestrated his decline. Accusations of poison flew like daggers. Historical letters reveal he demanded humiliating examinations, physicians probing her for signs of treachery, her composure cracking under the ordeal yet holding firm. Under pressure from Carlists like his brother Don Carlos and Minister Francisco Colomadi, he briefly repealed the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which had secured Isabella's succession. By allowing female heirs only to reinstate it days later, his vacillation a testament to crumbling. Wilm, Christina endured, her empowerment forged in silence, whispering to allies while cradling Isabella, planting seeds of a matrilineal future amid the king's chaos. The part closes on Ferdinand's inexorable decline. Bedridden in a chamber cluttered with relics, faded maps of lost empires, crucifixes glinting in candlelight, the dread palpable as sweat-soaked sheets clung to his form. His shadow, once a devouring force that consumed brides and realms, now turned inward, consuming him in isolation. Whispers of death hovered, the palace walls closing like a sarcophagus. While Christina's light, her integrated anima of cunning and compassion, grew brighter, poised to illuminate Spain's fractured dawn beyond his grave. Ferdinand VII's death on September 29, 1833, unfolded like the final act of a Gothic tragedy in the dim-lit chambers of the Palacio Real, where the air hung heavy with the metallic tang of illness and the faint rot of unyielding denial. At 48, ravaged by gout, fevers, and the ceaseless note of paranoia, he expired amid a circle of physicians and courtiers. His last breaths ragged whispers of accusation convinced to the end that poison from Christina's hand had felled him. Historical accounts preserved in Spanish archives and diplomatic letters describe a king who had outlived his empire's glory. Under his rule, Spain lost nearly all its American colonies in a cascade of revolutions, from Mexico's independence in 1821 to Bolivia's in 1825, leaving the once vast realm a hollow shell. But the autopsy, conducted in secrecy by royal surgeons, unveiled a horror that transcended politics, a body scarred not just by disease, but by rumored self-inflicted wounds, desperate attempts to correct the deformity that had defined his torment. Whispers from court insiders, echoed in later sensational chronicles, suggest incisions and burns, symbols of a psyche fractured by denial. Where Ferdinand's shadow self, Una's archetype of repressed darkness, had turned inward in futile rage against his own flesh, the deformity itself, that grotesque inheritance of Bourbon and breeding, became a macabre relic in death, legends fueled by 19th-century gossip and modern retellings claim parts of it were preserved perhaps in shadowed Vatican vaults or Elascoriales cryptas. Proof of virility for dynastic scrutiny, a chilling emblem of an unintegrated psyche. Buried in the pantheon of kings at the monastery of El Escorial, his tomb a cold marble sentinel amid ancestors' remains. Ferdinand's corpse symbolized the ultimate failure, a king who projected his inner chaos onto wives, courtiers, and country, never confronting the vulnerability that birthed his tyranny. Jung would diagnose this as the shadow as unchecked dominion, shame over his monstrous form morphing into vindictive control, destroying intimacy and empire alike emotionally. It's a poignant tragedy. Imagine the boy prince, twisted by genetics, evolving into a despot whose final isolation mirrored his lifelong dread. Cold sweats and nightmares culminating in a solitary grave. Yet, from this abyss rose the true legacy. Female empowerment, forged in the crucible of his horrors. Maria Cristina, the fourth bride whose cunning awakening had subverted his curse, ascended as regent for their daughter Isabella II. A 3-year-old queen thrust into a storm of succession wars. Historical records detail Christina's regency from 1833 to 1840 as a whirlwind of intrigue and reform, facing the First Carlist War, where Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos rallied ultra-conservatives against female rule, and the Salic Law she allied with liberals, granting amnesties and promoting constitutional tweaks to stabilize the throne. Her anima assumes inner strength integrated fully here, transforming deception into diplomacy, remarrying secretly to Agustin Fernando Muoz, a lowly sergeant, mere months after Ferdinand's death. She bore 8 more children in scandalous bliss, her actions a defiant reclamation of autonomy. Whispers of illegitimacy dogged Isabella, but Christina's resolve shielded her, navigating court plots with a mother's ferocity and a stateswoman's guile internally. Her struggle persisted, guilt over past lies clashing with triumphant survival. Dreams of Ferdinand's accusatory gaze yielding to visions of a matrilineal Spain. Isabella II's reign, from 1833 to her exile in 1868, amplified this empowered shadow, crowned amid cannon fire and Carlist uprisings that ravaged northern Spain for 7 years. Costing over 200,000 lives, she embodied the feminine spirit unbowed. Historical narratives portray her as vivacious yet volatile, a queen who weathered scandals, including rumored affairs and political corruption, but who modernized Spain through railways, education reforms, and the abolition of slavery in colonies. Yom would applaud. These women confronted the dark animus of patriarchal tyranny. Emerging stronger, their psyches alchemized by suffering into resilience. Christina's regency, marked by the Statute of 1834 that balanced monarchy with parliamentary input, sowed seeds of liberalism, while Isabella's era saw the rise of bourgeois power. Hinting at democracy's dawn, emotionally, it's a symphony of redemption. From Maria Antonia's shattered innocence to Christina's strategic triumph, each bride's torment birthed a legacy where revenge wasn't bloodshed. But then comes the quiet erosion of Ferdinand's absolutism through female agency. Spain healed slowly, scarred by civil strife and economic ruin. A cautionary tale of psychological depths where unintegrated shadows devour nations, the Carlist Wars dragged into the 1870s. Ideological fractures echoing Ferdinand's personal fractures, but the feminine line endured. Isabella's daughter eventually paving the way for the Bourbon Restoration. In this terrifying true story drawn from dusty archives and whispered anecdotes, the drama peaks not in violence but survival, Ferdinand's shadow once a consuming void, dissipated against the eternal light of the feminine spirit and bowed unbreakable reshaping history. From the ashes of horror, as El Escorial's winds howl over his tomb, one imagines his restless soul confronting the integration he denied, while Christina and Isabella's legacies whisper of empowerment's quiet roar.